Tell me about the area you were born in.
I was born in a place called Umeria, Central Provinces of India, one of 6 brothers, 3rd generation civil service in India.
So what's the family lineage like? How did we get into India?
Well, first and foremost, my father's father went to India in, I forget the year, but anyway, he was the first one who went there, and he was employed by the Bengal Nagpur Railway as the chief purchasing agent. And he had the usual privileges. I mean, he eventually brought his wife out. They had 1 boy and 2 girls, who my father was trained as a geologist. And
sent off to England to do that?
Yes, he went to England at the age of 12, and then from then on he went to public schools in England, and on to London College, London College of Geology. And he had 2 sisters who stayed in York, and in Hull, I beg your pardon, in Yorkshire. And
so they all grew up in India, did they?
Up till the age of 12, my father and his sisters grew up in India.
They were shipped off to boarding school?
And then they were shipped off to England, to boarding school. And my father was eventually married to my mother, and I forget the year of that too, but anyway, she was a 2nd generation Irish woman, and with a fiendish temper, I might add. And she was educated in England, in Girton College, in the University of Cambridge.
Business or finishing school?
No, that was business school. She got her BA, and she only graduated knots, and that's all she did. And then she came out for a visit to India and met my father. They were married. My grandfather, my mother's father, was the chief engineer on the Bengal Nagpur Railway. And he built most of the railway in our area, in the Umaria, Bilaspur area. He laid the railroad. And my grandmother on my mother's side died as a very young woman, while my mother was still in her early childhood. And so eventually, my father was seconded or lent to the state of Rewa, which is a principality in the central India. And he went there and was, while the prince was growing up and too young to ascend the throne, he managed the estate. And he was highly successful. He made a good job of it, and so much so that when the Maharaja decided that he had to go back to India, to the civil service, my father said he had to go back to the civil service, He said, I won't let you, I'll treble your salary if you'll just stay on here and manage the estate. So by this time my father was doing reasonably well there. He was comparatively well regarded, although he didn't speak a word of the language. And he discovered the Central India coal fields, which were a very large asset, earn a lot of currency for the British Indian government. And so he eventually retired when I was 8 years old. And we went to Tasmania to settle. We thought that's where we would live the rest of our lives, but neither my mother nor my father cared much for the Australians. So a year later, I was on my way back to India via Canada and Japan and the normal liner lines until we got back to India. And then my mother had me baptized Catholic because my father was a Protestant. And he didn't like the idea of Catholic kids. So she got that opportunity, and then she went to England and waited for my father to come back after he sold the orchard in Australia, and picked us up, and then we went back to India. And from that time, my father went up to a place called Ranchi, which is in Bihar province, and my mother went to Uttar Pradesh, which is the province of the timber barons and so on, and she went into partnership with this fellow who marketed lumber, the equivalent of lumber, they called it timber there. And we got thoroughly neglected. By this time I was 13 years old, and I hadn't had any education at all. And my two younger brothers were younger. One was 2 years younger and one was 3 years younger. And so we had to fend for ourselves, and most of the meat on the table came from my gun. We had bush our property consisted of 300 and something acres.
Maybe describe what your immediate area was like. Was there a town?
No, the nearest town was 2 miles away, and that was Pendra Road. Bilaspur. That was just a haywire sort of a place. It was the only place. People there were really Aborigines. They didn't have much sense of being persons. I mean, they were all indiscriminately born and raised. I mean, they weren't even educated. They were just turned loose. And they worked for menial wages, very small wages. Can you stop for a minute? I want to have a cup of tea.
Just feel free to have it anytime. You were stopping. Okay, what's that?
I don't know.
Too full.
Whatever. Yeah, it's quite full.
Things breaking up too much.
I don't know, but I can hear it from here.
What is breaking up?
This is a wireless microphone. And the batteries must be a little bit weak, because once in a while we can hear the ocean.
Hear what?
Well, it just starts.
It hisses.
A little bit of hiss comes in. I can hear it from here. And Gloria can hear it.
I can hear it too.
Ready to continue?
Yeah.
I better see it. Okay. Anyway, we were just talking about the immediate vicinity of where you were growing.
That was in Marna, a place called Marna, and next 2 miles from Pendra Road. And the only white people in that area were a fellow called Darby and a chap called Thompson. They lived together, and I never suspected even that they were homosexuals. I mean, you know, that just shows how naive I was. But anyway, he was
Do you think other people?
I'm not sure that they knew. I don't think they knew. I'm quite sure. But they maintained a fairly good standard of living, and he was instrumental in getting me the first money-producing thing that I did. I mean, you know, he guaranteed me, he formed the application for me to get a tent peg contract, which they came and inspected the area and said, yes, I was capable of doing it. And then he supervised it for a little while until he knew I could handle it. And he got me this contract, and we hired the labor. They went into the bush and cut the trees down, the saplings, shaped them into tent peg shapes, and then we piled them up and waited for the inspector to come and inspect them. You've got to remember, I was 13 years old at the time, and then he backed out. He left me to run my own business, and we almost decimated the 300 acres, 250 acres, and produced enough wood, tent pegs, to keep a half-decent standard of living. We were able to pay a servant and buy groceries and do the various things that we had not been able to do prior to that. But the advantage in the fact of our education was that we had learned how to read and write in Australia. And so when we came to the farm in India, we had a beautiful library. I mean, my father had a marvelous library, thousands of books. And my brothers and I, we read voraciously. So when eventually at the age of 17, I went to Ranchi to rejoin the family. And by that time my mother had moved up there. And she got me my first job as an apprentice on the French Motor Car Company, which I hated. And then eventually, by pulling strings, she got me a job in the Indian Tea Cess Committee.
With the French Motor Company, is that trying to sell Cessnas or something?
No, that was the Renaults mostly. They had the Renaults were the car they handled. And I wasn't in sales, I was in mechanicking. And most of the time I just made shapes, tiled shapes. Mm-hmm. So I have no real experience of motor car. But anyway, from there...
Backtracking a bit, what was your environment like when you were growing up? The
total isolation.
Farm was away from everything else.
2 miles.
And was it
in the forest?
Like a farmhouse, or was it?
No, it was four rooms straight in a line, and
on one floor?
On one floor, and it had a plinth about 2.5 feet high.
What's a plinth?
Foundation sort of thing. Mm-hmm. 2.5 feet high, and you had to walk up steps to get up there. It was totally feral. I mean, very wild. My mother had left 8 dogs, and every night almost we had to rescue one or other of them from panthers. They'd grab the dog, taking it away to eat, and the dog would create an awful howl, and we'd go out with lamps and so on and so forth, rescue these things. It was really comical. And
you had so many?
Yeah, but we didn't lose one. Always rescued them all. And they had the strangest names. One was called Guess, and one was called Ask It. Strange names. And
so the house inside, was that primitive, or was it?
It was, I mean, it had curtains, and it had a dinner table, and one room had a dinner table in it. The other room was a sort of lounge, and then 2 were bedrooms and bathrooms.
So were all your brothers and you in one room?
Well, mostly we slept in 2 rooms. There were 2 bedrooms, mm-hmm. And the two younger boys slept in one, and I was given a room to myself because I did most of the work. So they extended that courtesy to me, and the kitchen was way away. So, they had to bring another house. And then we had servants' quarters, 12 servants' quarters.
And those were other little houses around?
The other houses were at least a mile away in the village. And you could hear the workers coming in the morning, sing to work and sing going home. And they worked from 6 in the morning till 12, and then took 2 hours off and worked from 2 till 6 again. So they put in a good day's work.
And what were they doing?
Mostly tilling the fields and
growing what crop?
Growing rice mostly. Rice and sugarcane. Sugarcane was our cash crop. And rice was our, it was everybody's staple. They all ate rice. And when I started going back there, many years later, I used to shoot a pig for the natives. They'd hunt it, they'd bring it out, and I'd shoot it. And that was the only meat they got for years, once a year.
So they couldn't shoot it themselves?
They had no guns. And they were totally illiterate. I mean, I don't think they were responsible people. So...
But obviously happy.
Well, I'm not sure about happiness. There's... When your name isn't even on a register anywhere, you don't know whether you're happy or not. I mean, it's miserable, especially for women. Terrible, I think.
So
the girls would marry, the girls wouldn't marry. I mean, they'd be married at the age of 5 or 6, but they wouldn't go to their husbands' houses until they reached the age of puberty. And in the meantime, they'd make other arrangements, and they'd elope with somebody else who took their fancy, and the husband would then be paid for the marriage costs and so on. So it never ended up in the wife living with the husband, although they were married at the age of 5 or 6.
How was it that you learned Urdu before English?
Well, I spoke Chhattisgarhi first. That's the first language I learned was Chhattisgarhi.
Why?
The natives all spoke Chhattisgarhi. So that's the first language.
Wouldn't you talk to your parents?
My parents were never with me. From the age of 11 or 12, my parents never stayed with me.
You were learning to talk.
Well, I'd learned how to talk. I'd learned how to, and mind you, I was brought up in India. So at my father's appointment where he worked, I'd learned how to speak Urdu, but not English, because I seldom saw my parents. You'd have to go and see.
Well, who taught you Chhattisgarhi?
Well, Chhattisgarhi we learned in this place that we went to when we were 10. When we came back from England, when we were 10, we went and built a house in this property, which was more or less homesteaded. And we made our own bricks and put the building together and tiled it with tiles made out of our own clay and so on. So we...
But this house in the jungle wasn't the place where you had to dress for dinner and everything?
Yes. My father, every time I visited him, after he had his accident and lost all his money, he became my charge. I looked after him until he died. And he insisted that I dress for dinner every night. So you'd have to have a bath and wear tuxedos to dinner to let this old man have his way.
Did it have indoor bathroom?
No. The bathroom was, you had a servant called a sweeper, and he was an untouchable. He was of a very poor class of person. In India, still untouchables are untouchable. And when you had finished, you just called him, and he came and took the results away. And then he cleaned the thing out and brought it back. So that was his job, and that was the one servant. And in the bush, when we were the young kids, We didn't have a soulifer, we couldn't afford him. So we only had the one man who cooked for us, and we used the trees, the bush as toilets. So that's basically what, and you know, my two brothers were brainy, you know, they were naturally brilliant. So my younger brother passed through school in 1 year, got his matriculation, and my youngest brother took him 2 years. And he did it.
The entire schooling was 1 year?
1 year and 2 years. My youngest.
What level of schooling?
Matriculation, that's the equivalent of high school, grade 12.
They didn't go to grade 10 or 11 or anything?
Nothing at all. They just went straight to grade 11 and 12. And then, so then my mother managed to get me into the Indian Tea Cess Committee, which was, you know, normally it would have required us education, but I could speak well enough. It was just that by this time I didn't have my grammar straight, and I didn't have, you can tell when a person isn't educated. And then my brother and I went, Esmond, my brother who just died in England, he and I tried to get the old man's money back for him when he had been swindled by a chap called A.E.J. Abraham. I still remember his name. He was a Jew and he had a seat on the stock market in Calcutta. And we didn't get any money back, but I got an education out of it because the lawyer that we had hired, he was a Cambridge educated lawyer, and he remarked that I had no education. He said, if you'd like, I'll give you a syllabus, and if you study it 4 to 6 hours a day, you'll have an entire education by the time you're 6.5 years elapsed. So it took me 8.5 years, but I did do exactly what he said, and I met him once a month to iron out any...
What was his name?
Banerjee. No, not Banerjee. Oh, I've forgotten his name.
Oh, well.
I think it was Banerjee. Anyway, as I studied this syllabus religiously every day for 6 hours, every day. And when I went back to him, finally, after 8.5 years, he said, you've got a good education. So, partly it was due to him. I mean, he told me what music to listen to, what paintings to collect, what, you know, a complete syllabus of Aristotle, all the reading I should do and all the, you know, it was very helpful of him.
Was this his own syllabus that he wrote? Or?
He wrote it, well, he wrote up the syllabus for me. He told me what books to read and so on and so forth. The arithmetic, the higher mathematics, all that sort of nonsense. He compressed it as much as he could, but it still took me, he reckoned 6.5 years. It took me 8.5 years to do it. So it was a lot of work.
And working at the same time.
And working at the same, well, of course, I had a job, inspector first in the Indian Tea Cess Committee, then they changed.
What did that involve?
I had a staff of 6 fellows that traveled around with me, and they'd each have a table. We'd buy the tea in bulk, and then they'd advertise it. They'd try to, because India, you know, England drinks 9 pounds of tea a year per person. In India, they drink 3 ounces per year per person on average population. So the idea was that if we increased the sale of tea in India, we'd improve the economy of the country. But I'm not sure that it entirely worked. But however, that was not for me to question.
Well, they drink tea now.
I suppose they do, but if they can afford it. Not sure that they can. And it's a very, very poor country. I mean, tea, it either means tobacco or tea, and usually they choose tobacco. Because the tobacco too is so cheap, you know, it's poor quality stuff. So then I had my two brothers to support on the Dufferin. They passed their matriculation and then they went to the naval training ship. Jerry was trained on the same ship.
Was that their choice of what they wanted to do?
They had no choice.
Oh,
I mean, that's all I could afford.
Or were they conscripted at that point? Or?
No, they went, I sent them, I told them I could afford to send them to the Dufferin, and they could train as deck officers, but they had to do it. I mean, they had to do all the work and pass the examinations and do all the rest of it. So I just paid them the Dufferin, whatever the minimum was. Jerry's father was a telegraph superintendent, and he could afford more, so Jerry had a simpler time of it. But for me, those two kids out at sea in Bombay, and my father teetering on the brink of disaster, I had quite a lot in the way of supporting to do.
Mm-hmm.
But fortunately, very soon after that, the fellow Halford, the chap I worked for in the TSES committee, he asked me if I wanted to travel. And instead of this 100 rupees a month, he then gave me the same 100 rupees a month, but he gave me board and room. Wherever I went, he paid for it.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I got these 6 chaps working for me. And they'd make tea and hand it out free to the public. Whoever wanted a cup of tea could have it, and they served it in mud cups, baked in a kiln, of course, and then the fellow threw the mug away as soon as he's finished with it. So that's the way I started in life. And then later on I was promoted to assistant superintendent, and then ultimately to superintendent. Then when I was inspector still, I was sent to Bangalore, which is South India, and transferred back because a Portuguese girl that my mother had given shelter to, at my expense incidentally, reported to my mother that there were too many girls there and that I shouldn't be left there, that I should be removed. So she spoke to Halford again, and I was transferred back to Lucknow. And but you know, they play on you all the time, these people. However, so from there I became an assistant superintendent in Allahabad, and then from Allahabad I was transferred to Dhaka in what is now Bangladesh, and that's where I had most fun. I had a launch to myself. The only person who used it was me, and
Was it a large boat?
it was about 64 feet or something, and it had a captain and a sarang, they call them, and one of a crew and my servant. He manned the galley. But I had all duplicate clothing. I'd just leave the thing in the cabin, and then whenever I needed to go out, I'd tell the sarang to get steam up, and off we'd go.
Was this to sail to specific points?
Yes, and we had these inspectors, each had a territory, and each had 5 or 6 men working for them, and they'd again try to sell tea everywhere. That was the main pursuit. And then eventually they changed the name to Indian Tea Marketing Board, and that put us in line for full recognition as civil servants.
We're breaking up again. Battery is pretty weak.
Not,
Maybe it's the camera that interferes.
what appears with? What interferes with?
The camera might be interfering with it. The camera has radio frequency too. Anyway,
So that was it. And that was where I had the most fun in my life. I was a good horseback rider. I initially played polo, but
did you have some place that you stayed other than?
I had a house. No, I had a house rented,
Mm-hmm.
but when I needed steam on the launch,
Mm-hmm.
I'd ask for it. I mean, I'd tell the captain to get steam up. And but we had a house. I mean, you know, every superintendent was supplied with a house, and quite a comfortable house. I mean, nothing to be ashamed of. And so I stayed there for 3 years, and being fond of horses, I got permission from the jockey, from the club at the Dakar Club, to ride as a gentleman jockey. I loved it. I mean, I had 2.5 years of real fun. I was sorry, in fact, when I had to go, because I didn't really want to
You
leave.
rode every day?
No, I'd go out in this launch to do my work, and I'd try to get back by Saturday, which was race day,
Mm-hmm.
and then train the horse on Sunday, and then go out in the field again on...
You didn't race, did you?
I raced myself. I rode the horses. I trained them and rode them.
Did you ever win?
Oh, I won enough so that I gave the horses to the club when I left, and they didn't owe me a nickel.
Mm.
But I knew when I was going to win. I mean, I had a lady friend who used to put money on me. So she'd give me...
Inside betting?
Yeah, I'd bet on myself when I felt I was going to win. But the jockeys were utterly ruthless. I mean, they were, they were 40 pounds lighter than I was. I mean, but they'd still try and trip me out of my saddle and bump up against me and try to ride me down and all that sort of thing. So it was an interesting period. But anyway, I was transferred again to Lahore, and that's where I met your mother.
Mm-hmm.
And
what were you doing in Lahore? Same type of thing?
I had a superintendent's position, which was, I didn't have to visit so closely. I mean, I had 2 cars. One was for touring, it was a Chevrolet, and then I had
What type of car?
a Chevrolet,
What type of car?
a sedan, I guess. Yes, a sedan. And in town, I used to use a Hillman Minx. So I could do without the chauffeur then, but traveling I had to use the chauffeur. And so then I was transferred up there in 1939, I guess. I met your mother, and she was on her way to going back to school in February. It was February I was transferred, so she was going back to school in March, I guess. And I went up there for a holiday at Easter time to say hello again. And then we decided to get married in December when she came back from school.
Mm.
She was teaching.
And you were staying in her mother's?
Yeah, I was staying in that guest house. She had a boarding house.
Mm-hmm.
And then eventually I moved from there when they decided that we needed a full office in Lahore. I took the front half of the bungalow, and the office was put in the back half.
So this rooming house, is it like a hotel, or was it?
It's just like a hotel.
Or like a bed and breakfast type place?
No, they served full meals, 3 meals a day.
How many rooms would it have?
I think it had about 14 rooms, and the old man, Mr. Barnes Cook, he used to live in the shed in the servants' quarters. He didn't live in the house. He's a strange fellow. Yeah, he came out here. You know him. And I remember Jenny coming back from school, and her grandfather had fallen down the well. And I remember she shouted to Granddad and said, "What are you doing down there?" She was very amused at his carryings on. But anyway, that's a later date. But So,
While we're on him, he rode motorcycles or something like that?
in Lahore, he used to ride a motorcycle.
Somehow I could never picture him on a motorcycle.
He was really a very queer duck. I must say, I found him very strange. But, you know, he was much better known than I was.
Yeah.
I mean, everybody knew him as Cheerio.
Especially I know when we were here in Bond Street, he was sure well known.
Yeah, he was very well known. And he'd walk 20 miles a day. And at that age, I mean, that's 75 years old. Pretty far reaching. But, you know, you had to find room for all these people. And my mother, I supported her from the day. Well, first and foremost, I was injured in a motor car accident, this thing. And,
that was what, you got sideswiped or something?
no, the tire blew off. This was in primitive days of motor cars. I mean, they didn't build them. Now they used to put a wire into and put a tube in. And you know, if you were going fast and if the front tire blew, you were in trouble. So I just happened to hit an electric pole and was thrown and broke my arm. But in the meantime, I also had concussion and ribs broken. So I had to heal the ribs and the concussion first before I could go and have this seen to, because I had to go for this to Calcutta. But anyway, that's a different story. So that's the story up to 1941, and then in 1941 I was conscripted, which is unheard of in the civil service. They never conscript a person from the civil service because, but then they knew I spoke a number of languages, and they had this training school in mind where they eventually sent me. They kept me in Lahore for 4 or 5 months, and then they sent me to Jabalpur, where the training center was, and they put me through a course, and I stood first in the course.
Mom went with you?
No. She stayed in Lahore because she was expecting a child. And your brother was stillborn, so she eventually joined me in Jabalpur, and both Sylvia and Jenny were born in Jabalpur.
Yeah.
But
was that a government house, or did you have to buy that?
no, we were supplied with accommodation. The first lot of accommodation I was supplied with was terrible, I thought. I mean, you know, 4 little rooms in a row and drastically primitive. Up till the time Mother joined me, I didn't have a house. I mean, I just lived in the mess. And you live fairly cheaply there. I mean, But then, when Mommy came to stay with me, and before I was promoted, I lived in the mess. And then later on, I was given this house, number 1 Denning Road, a tremendous great house. But by that time, I was a lieutenant colonel, so you get the house according to your. And I had an acre of land and a gardener to attend to it, and
help out here and there.
it was an interesting experience, the army, because I'd never had it so good really until I joined the army. Because I got all the privileges of a white man and none of the handicaps. In the army, I mean, you know, if you were an Anglo-Indian, if you had any color in your blood, you didn't get all the allowances that you got when you were a white man. And so I made very good money in the few years in the army, 6 years. And then we decided that we should think of other things, and we decided first to go to New Zealand, and then I didn't like much about New Zealand because it was socialist, and that's not my religion. And then I came to Canada as an alternate, the Colliers had invited us to think about Canada. I came out and stayed with them for 4.5 months in the summer of 1946. Went back to India, and I had agreed that if I was taken back to India, I would serve after this holiday, I would serve the government of India for 2 years before I got a discharge. But they wanted me to swear an oath of allegiance to the new Indian government, and I refused. So they fired me. And that was what I wanted. I wanted to come out to Canada and start. I was 37 years old, and I was getting long in the tooth. So
if you were going to move, you better move now.
I better move now. And so for 5 years we farmed. And I thought we were doing relatively well, but because in 5 years I had a $5,000 mortgage, I paid off the mortgage.
Mm-hmm.
So that's pretty good going for 5 years on a mixed farm out in the Fraser Valley, 10-acre farm.
Yeah.
And but then I got Newcastle disease in the chickens, and I had 4,000 or 5,000 chickens, and that just about bankrupted me, except that the government paid top prices for them, and that saved my bacon.
Mm.
So, and I had at least, at that time I had about 60 pigs, but from time to time I had 100 pigs on the farm. And I had 1 cow and 2 milking goats. We drank goat's milk steady. So what else can I tell you?
Anyway, when did you had a personal servant for a number of years?
17 years.
Where did he pop in?
He came at Lucknow when I went back from Bangalore to Lucknow. And so he was a very faithful fellow. He died the last year I was there.
And he traveled everywhere with you?
Everywhere, in spite of the fact that in most places he couldn't speak a word of the language. So he'd come to me and ask me the names of the various groceries he wanted to buy. And he'd stand behind my chair, never sat down. All the time I had him, he would refuse to sit down. And he's a very loyal fellow.
And he would do your groceries? And
he would buy the groceries, and he would, in the early stages when I first hired him and I thought he was honest, I said, I don't like the way you read out these groceries to me. You tell me that piyaj and then onion, or that mean the same thing. One is English and the other is Urdu. So he said, well, I don't mind what you do. I said, I'll increase your wages if you need more money. No, he said, I don't think that would pay you because I'm going to send all my money to my wife. Whatever I get, I'll send to my wife. So he said, let me steal 4 annas a day. That's 4 annas is a nickel. A little over a nickel. So we came to an agreement, and then after that I trusted him implicitly. So the various traveling I did as a superintendent and assistant superintendent, I just would hand over my paycheck to him and tell him when he was at the end of the month to put whatever was left over in the bank. I never worried about it at all. But Mommy, of course, she wouldn't handle that at all.
And with all this traveling and everything, was there always accommodations made for him as well, or did you have to
No, he'd go and live in the servants' quarters, and the kitchen was a combined kitchen and servants' quarters. So every person who traveled to those places, they're called dark bungalows, which means mail stations. And so everywhere we occupied that place, there'd be an accommodation for him. And when we got stable and we didn't travel much, then he would, like in Jabalpur, where I had a bungalow, he would live in the servants' quarters. And he'd have his wife over from Lucknow to come and visit with him and so on. But it's...
What was his name?
Mumtaz Ali.
Mumtaz is...
Mumtaz is his first name and Ali is the family name. He was a very nice servant. Very fine fellow.
Was he... Did you treat him like a servant, or was he more... Was he a companion?
He wouldn't ever sit down in my presence. I mean, he always kept his own distance. I didn't...
So was he like a butler, or was he...
No, he was just my personal servant. I mean...
Like a companion to you? Did you...
Oh, no. I talked to him at night because when we got to strange countries where he didn't speak the language, he'd get so damn lonesome that he'd stand behind my chair and talk to me.
But you've never played cards? Or...
Oh, no, nothing like that. No, nothing like that.
I think you should talk about the life in the villages when you were looking after, sponsoring all Aboriginal people and didn't know any white people at all.
Well, I didn't know any white people until I knew them before I was 8. Mm-hmm. I knew there were very few in Umeria, which was my father's place of residence. And then you see, the only person I met ever was a governess who we'd meet once in a while, you know. She'd come to me particularly, I mean, she'd come to instruct me. But otherwise, always we were handled by servants.
Mm-hmm. Tell about your supporting the Aborigines in the village when they needed wild pigs to...
Yes, I used to shoot. I told them that I would shoot the pigs.
Yeah, but you'd have to go and arrange and shoot one for them.
That's right. They would drive it out, and I would just shoot it, and they'd take it away. I never saw it.
While we're on that type of thing, why not tell some of the stories about the animal life and everything around your farm? There's the story of your father and his snake skin.
What was that?
The boa constrictor that...
Oh, yes, not my father, my stepfather.
Your stepfather.
Yeah, he was a punk. But anyway, he got me to put ears to the ground to find out where he could get a python skin.
Oh, the python?
Python. And eventually the news came through that there was a python guarding a trail along which animals passed. So
Was this within your property? Or?
Yes, within my property. I mean, we had 300 acres of this stuff. I mean, you know, there was lots of property. And so we got up to this place where the natives had said the python was, and there he was rolled around the tree waiting to drop on an animal of some kind. And I said, here, there's your python. But he handed the gun to me. He said, you shoot it. Because he said, I'm not sure of my aim. So I shot the thing for him. And it slipped down, it was in its death roll. It came down the tree. And he ran up thinking that he would be able to prevent it from hurting itself and marring the skin. So... and the python still had enough instinct in it to start choking him. So I ran and unwound the snake all the time. He was being choked to death. That was interesting. But I should have let it finish its job, as I later found out. I supported him for many years too. He was another no-good son of a gun. But anyway...
Then there were tigers?
The only bad experience I had with a tiger was in 1936 when King Edward VIII abdicated the throne. And my battery, wireless, had no battery. It hadn't been charged, so there was no battery. So I walked down to hear the speech at a fellow called Angar's place. He was Anglo-Indian. And everybody was very interested in this.
How far was that away?
2 miles. They were all 2 miles away. And so, coming home that night, it was after 8 o'clock by that time. And in India, there's no twilight, just suddenly dark and suddenly light. So I was on my way I was smoking a cigarette and I was minding my own business. I mean, just walking back home. And right in the middle of the highway was a tiger. And I was within 30 feet of it by the time I woke up to the fact that there was an animal present. I was smoking a cigarette and this damn thing burnt right through my hand before I felt pain or anything. I mean, I was just, rigor mortis had almost set in right there. And then this thing must have decided I was too scrawny or something. I don't know what was the problem with it. But he just kept flicking his tail down and then eventually got up, took one look at me, and then decided to beat it into the bush. I was scared stiff.
Now, didn't you see many tigers?
I saw a number. I mean, not many. We had, when the 1 year, 1941, I think it was, we went to Marna for Christmas. My mother had asked us to go down. We went to Sylvia, your mother and I, and we slept out on the veranda. There's a sort of covered roof, but you had a light by the side of your bed to keep.
Kind of an enclosed?
No, it was just a roof and a shed type of roof with no. It was just cool. That was the main idea. In India, you needed cool more than anything else. And your mother heard this tiger roar. My goodness, she said, "Don't dare go to sleep before that." She had never heard a tiger make a noise before. So that's the other tiger story. But the panthers, my goodness, we had a lot of them.
You just see them all the time?
Well, they'd grab these dogs,
Only at night?
Only at night. They'd grab the dogs.
You didn't have electricity there, did you?
No.
So,
Kerosene oil lights.
So you see them by the flicker of the lamp?
Right, and you'd hear the dog yelp. I mean, that was the main way.
How would you go to find the thing? You just follow the sound?
Oh, we'd just take a light out and dash after it until it would drop it. There'd be a lot of people around, Chris. I mean, the dogs were making a noise and the servants were all rushing backwards and forwards. But yes, I agree with what Mary says. The village was captive to us. I mean, all the work they got came from the family, from us.
Were they just there for the farm, or?
No, the village was off the farm. Actually, it wasn't a part of the farm. It was a village. And there were maybe, I don't know how many, 30 people or 40 people in this little village.
Did the village exist before the farm was there, or did it?
Oh, no, it was there before we bought the farm. It was there, and then over the years, we planted a lot of trees. That was one thing. We had mangoes, lemons, oranges, grapefruit, papayas, guavas, mulberries. We had a lot of fruit. And we had perhaps...
So was there an orchard there as well?
Yes, the orchard we planted it. And but that was what saved our lives when we were starving in the early days. I mean, we had no money at all because our parents had totally forgotten us. So eventually, this tent peg contract.
Why ever did they buy this farm in the middle of nowhere?
I have no idea. But mind you, it was a beautiful part of the country.
You think for a geologist, why would?
I don't know. I really couldn't say, but it was a beautiful outlook. We had a banyan tree there, which was, I don't know, about 40 feet around the middle. And it had tremendous great branches, and all the hives, the wild bees would make hives, And so every year we'd just go and slice one hive, burn it off burn the insects off so they didn't bite you, and then put a bamboo pole into the hive, cut it off at the branch, and it would slide down into a tub. And you had honey, 40, 50, 60 pounds of honey. So it was there were a lot of advantages to living there. But
what type of country was it? Was it
mountainous. It was the central.
I don't know. But
It's the Central India range, and it had a river in it, and it had fields, a lot of rice fields, paddies. They call them paddies.
is it like rolling hills? Or
It is more or less hilly, but
the property itself, was it sort of rolling?
I would think so, slightly, not very much, but slightly.
It was like a field? Or?
Well, there were lots of fields, each individual field, because you had to grow rice by flooding it. You couldn't, then they'd transplant the rice, they'd plant it in one field, and then they'd pull it up and transplant it to the correct distance apart when the time came. It was quite skillfully done, but very primitive. I mean, I bought a tractor for them when I started working, and the tractor ended up a bundle of rust. I mean, they just didn't think it was worth maintaining. They'd rather work.
Tell us how you dealt with the alligators when they became vicious and ate a few people.
Well, you just shoot them. And you'd often find the alligators were the crocodiles or whatever you like to call them. They were actually the taxidermists would take 2 pelts and give you one back tanned. So that's what I like to do. I didn't like to shoot one crocodile. I'd shoot 2 crocodiles and send them have them skinned, and then.
Well, didn't you shoot them when they became dangerous?
Oh, well, I mean, there were a number of occasions when you shot them because they were dangerous, but that wasn't the main reason.
Would call on you
to shoot them. And you'd often find bangles in their stomachs. The women, they'd catch the women going down to get water from the river and eat them, and then bangles would end up in the stomach. So, but it's a very strange country. And now, the population explosion is so tremendous. They've got, in the place where we lived, India at that time was 450 million people. Now it's become 3 countries, and India alone has 750 million. So that's in 40 years.
Well, what do you think happened to that area? Do you think it's still, life is going on in that area, is still the same, or is it?
I think they've improved their standard of living. For one thing, the irrigation projects that we had started as government have now matured, and they're getting the benefits of that irrigation up in the Punjab, and that's why the Sikhs want their independence, because they don't want to share the riches with the rest of the country. They only represent 1.8% of the population, but they have perhaps 5 or 6% of the total income of the country.
Everybody getting tired?
Well, yeah, I was wondering, are you getting tired? You should continue in the morning.
Well, we should probably do that if we're going to do any more of this.
It's gold.
Hey?
It's gold. It used to be fairly inexpensive there compared to what it was elsewhere in the world.
Well, gold is, it's just as difficult to get at.
It's a worldwide commodity.
India.
Like, it's 550 or 400 and some odd dollars an ounce here. It's the same price over there.
It's a commodity.
It's always been that way.
I don't think so. I think in the old days, when I can remember, gold was $35 an ounce.
In India.
No, here.
Oh,
And when that was not that long ago, that's 30 years ago. And Mr. Mannix's personal advisor told me, he said, buy gold.
mm-hmm.
He said, advance the 10% or whatever the bank will accept it from you, and then hold $10,000 worth. He said, and it'll quadruple. It'll go up at least 4 or 5. No, I didn't.
But what I was wondering is like even a few years ago, did gold have a set price? I mean, was it the same say in India as it was in
I don't think so. I can't tell you because I don't know. But
Probably occurred once the commodity markets were.
Yeah, the reason I'm wondering is that I've heard, I don't know whether they're old wives' tales or not, but I have heard that at one time that gold was very cheap.
Well, it's cheap in the Middle East. I think it's still much cheaper than it is in Canada.
Because there were a lot, like, women wore gold trinkets, like
Right.
you wear
Well, when you
beads.
think of places like the Taj Mahal and everything, where they've got gold all over.
Right. And India seems to be very rich in gold. I mean, people didn't seem to treasure it as much as...
Well, of course they do. They do more so now than they did.
Mm-hmm.
But India has a very old culture, and gold is only one part of it.
Yeah.
I mean, gold and silver ornaments. Silver is particularly blessed because the poor can afford it.
Mm-hmm.
They save for all their lives to afford one piece of silver or something. So it's but gold has long been out of reach of the common people.
So how did you get associated with prices?
Well, my oldest brother, Evelyn, Rita's father, he got a job with the forestry department in Kyonjhar, which is the state where the prices were like my father. I mean, the prices were managing the estate for the prince to grow up.
Carol, sit down. Grandpa's telling a story. You want to listen? Okay, you sit down on the carpet and listen.
As I said, he worked like my father, waiting for a prince to grow up.
Yep.
And so price was the overall. Yes, certainly. And so he looked after the state until the boys grew up. He was there for 5 or 6 years. And during that period, I went and visited him. And he had a tame tigress. The boys were hunters. They mostly hunted for bounty because that's the only way they got pocket money. And like us, they were totally uneducated. The the middle boy, Bunny, he educated himself and he became a lawyer actually, a very clever fellow. And his oldest brother was a total drunkard. He was a lush, and yet he was marvelously accurate shooting. He'd hunt day and night if he could.
Probably not when he was after he'd been drinking.
Oh, well, the best shots were after he'd been drinking. And then Bunny was the middle boy, and then Morris was the youngest. And their sister, who was younger still, couldn't speak a word of English. She was totally savage. And she spoke to me in Uriya, which I could understand, and Bengali I spoke to her so that she could understand that. Orissa is the language, is the province, and Uriya is the language. And I spoke to her in Bengali and she understood it. And then there was the father had the powers of life and death. I mean, he was a magistrate, and he could sentence people to death. And he wanted the worst way for me to go and watch a man die on the rope. I said I wouldn't do that. But anyway, they had this tigress, and we used to go for a walk with it, take it for a walk. After the cattle had been in the corral and put to bed, we'd take this tigress on a walk. And she'd go with us with 2 lanterns, one ahead and one behind, and she'd stay in between. And then, but there was a little mongrel dog that gave her the signal when he wanted to go home. And she'd walk for as far as the mongrel didn't get tired, and then she'd have to take the mongrel in her mouth and carry him back home.
The tiger would.
And I remember the first evening I stayed with the Prices. Of course, it was much more companionable than my brother. I was at this time about 17 years old, because the Prices were very congenial, but tremendously neglectful of their kids. Anyway, the first night they chained the tiger to the bed and they shoved in another bed alongside where I was going to sleep, in Morris's room. And this tiger could reach me, so he just tossed me out of bed.
In the morning?
No, at night. So they had to then shorten the chain so that it couldn't reach me anymore. And on one occasion, when we were just going to take her for a walk, we had let her loose, and I tripped over backwards over a chair, and she jumped on top of me, and I thought the world had come to an end. It's a lot of weight on her.
How did they manage to feed her?
Well, they bought meat. They gave it meat most.
I think it'd be an expensive task.
Oh yes, very. But he was making good money. And then eventually, after I had associated with them for a long time, I left, of course. I had to go to this apprenticeship with the French Motor Car Company. And my brother stayed there, but then he married Rita's mother. And he got fired immediately, because in India you're not allowed to marry a dark woman. So he lost his job in the civil service. And my next brother also did the same thing. He lost his job because he married a dark woman. So anyway, that was the Prices. And then later on, much later on, I used to correspond with them, but much later on I revisited them. I happened to be in the area and I knew where they'd been transferred to, and I went and visited them, and I heard the story about the tiger. She was, the Governor General in Council pronounced her an unsafe creature to have in a populated area, so they obliged him to give her up, and he gave her to the zoo in Calcutta, but the keepers in Calcutta are all natives, and she wouldn't abide them. She couldn't stand the native keepers. So then Jew, member of the Stock Exchange, he paid her fare to England and gave her to the London Zoo. And she was there for a number of years, at any rate up till 35. So it was an experience at the Prices. And then he wrote to me much later on and wanted to buy a hotel in Lahore. No, I can't read to you, I have to talk. So
listen to the story. Listen to the story Grandpa's telling right now.
And then he invited me to, he was going to buy a hotel for his sons to run and to make a profit out of, he hoped, in Lahore. And he wrote to me and said, would I like to manage it? And I thought about it, but I really didn't think I could handle those 3 boys. They were totally yahoo. terrible, very, very ignorant people. And so I said, I'm very sorry, but I don't think it offers me sufficient scope for what I want to do with my life. And he was quite acceptive. And then eventually they sent the girl to a school in Missouri, and she was speaking good English by the time I last saw them. So that's the prices. And who else did I have association with? Well, Jabalpur was very interesting. I was eventually in charge of all training for India of clerks and storemen and courses in ammunition for officers. So I had a very big staff, and I had, 2 or 3 captains and several Viceroy's commissioned officers, right the way up to Havildar. So I had a lot of people, and the syllabus I had to draw up because they had no clue as to how to train these people. So I had to draw it up, and then finally towards the end of the war they sent me some WAC, W-A-C, for secretaries and so on. And I used to get a kick out of them on parade. My goodness, after hearing a sergeant major call the orders, and then to hear this little girl say, "Parade chun, parade chun." Sounded so peculiar coming from the great powerful lungs of a male.
So I remember you saying once about learning to drive a car. You had to, so some emergency or something?
No, we got, they had, the prices. They had, when I went to Kyonjar in 1917, in 1927, they had 3 cars, a T Ford, T model Ford, and a Buick, and what was the third one? A Chev. 3 cars they were allowed to use for the government cars. And then they had 4 elephants, and these elephants, 3 of them had babies. They don't breed in captivity, so you have to turn them loose. And then after they're bred, you recapture them and bring them back, and then they have their babies. So these were mischievous little devils. My goodness, I used to get a kick out of them. They'd go to have a bath with their mothers in the morning, and then they'd come back with their trunks full of water. They'd wait until they could catch you unawares, and then they'd squirt the trunk full of water at you. I thought they were awfully mischievous. And if you stood with your legs apart at all, they'd take a running leap and go through your legs and send you flying. They were very playful.
But I thought that sometime that you had to drive a car and you'd never driven a car.
No, that was the Model T Ford.
Yeah.
But I had watched them drive it. And
what was the circumstance behind that?
well, it was just that Mrs. Price wanted something from the market, and she said the boys were all out. So she said, "I'd like you to get me this, whatever it was, a pill or something." And there are no cars there, absolutely none. So there's no problem really. You just press in. It's a very easy car to drive. So we didn't have any real problem. And I could steer as soon as I touched it.
And I remember, who was the Maharaja or whatever, the light Model T?
He's Bharatpur. He stored.
Where was this?
In Bharatpur, which is in Rajputana. And he bought 12 Model T Fords because he thought they were going to change the model. So he wanted the ones with the clutch drive, just to shift gears just by pressing it down to start and then letting go to let it go into top gear. And he bought 12 of them just to store them so that he'd never be without
somebody you knew, or? Just
Oh, I knew him. I had been to Bharatpur. But, and he's now got the, well, of course he hasn't got it. The government of India has now got the biggest wildlife preserve in India now.
Tammy. You stuck it in my mouth. Was it your father that had a railway car of his own?
Yes. He never traveled on consultation without a railway car of his own. They'd have to pay him so much a day after he retired. They'd have to pay him so much a day, and they always gave him a carriage, attached it to a train that was going his way, and
then when he got to the location,
he just put it in the siding, and that was his residence while he lived there.
like almost like a motorhome.
But it was, you know, it was a big, lavish, great thing. And I thought, what a bloody ego this man's got. I couldn't bear the thought of putting them to all that expense. They'd pay him whatever it was, 1,000 rupees a day or something. And in addition, they'd have to get in this carriage to ride in. That's nonsense. I mean...
Was he very aristocratic?
Oh, absolutely. He was the fellow who, when the Viceroy and the Viceroy came to Umaria, he hosted them. And you know, that was a very great honor that the Viceroy did him. And I mean, you know, he had a tremendous great house, like an L shape. And we lived at the other end of the county.
Where was this house?
Umaria. That was where he lived officially, but as long as until he retired.
Oh.
So.
But you were born in this farm.
No, I was born in Umaria, which is where my father, before he retired, I was born 8 years before he retired.
Okay, and so Umaria. What type, was that his town or something?
That was the Raja's place of residence and the little village that went with it. There wasn't many people. There were probably 300 or 400 people. And of course later on it grew, because when my father discovered the coal, then it became a big place, because my goodness, the coal fields required a big staff, mining staff, and then loading staff for loading the trains, and so it became a relatively big place.
Do you remember this house when you married?
Yes, I remember.
What was it like?
It was, you know, it was...
Was it a lavish house, or was it?
Very lavish. Very lavish. And all the furniture was grand pianos, and, you know, they did a lot of entertaining in those days. It's since changed. I mean, you know, the country has since changed. We didn't have the freedom to entertain that my parents had. And we had, you know, we had so many servants. I mean, you know, just the part of the house that we lived in. We had the governess who was there just to govern me, because the other children weren't old enough yet to have her ministration.
They had an ayah or something?
Then they had the ayah. They had one ayah and then each one of us had a horse, so there were 3 people to look after the horses. And, you know, it was a lavish payroll.
And what other service did you do?
There was a fellow who had to clean the toilets, and the gardener to look after the garden.
As well as for daily type of thing?
Well, he was there all the time, because he had to be. I mean, otherwise you messed up. There was no sanitation. So and you always bathed in no bathtub. You had a plinth all around the area that the water had a drain hole in, and then you got the water warmed, whoever did it, I don't know who did it, and then they brought the warm water, and you poured it over yourself out of this tub, and the water drained away. So, but that was the way you bathed in those days. I had used a mug and poured the water over
How
yourself.
many rooms does this house have?
It had, I suppose, 9 rooms on each side, 9, and then across the middle where the reception area was, they had the guest rooms and the very large ballroom and that sort of stuff. So it was, after that, I mean, we were all felt, when we came back from Australia, we felt totally deprived. I mean, that was awful.
Was the kitchen
But it was far from us. I mean, the kitchen was always, in all Indian houses, the kitchen was a different house. It was, and it usually, in most of the houses we lived in after we married, the kitchen was part of the servants' quarters. One room of the kitchen was given over to cooking, and the rest of it was servants' quarters. I mean, we always had 5 or 6 servants. We had a fellow to do the laundry, a woman to look after the kids, my own personal servant, the cook, and the gardener. So we always had 5 or 6 servants. And then when I joined the army, they gave me a chauffeur and an orderly. So I had 8 servants.
Oh yeah. When your dad retired and you moved to this farm.
We moved to Australia.
Yeah.
Then when we came back,
how long were you in Australia?
1 year. And we came back via Canada, and I went to school in Robson Street for a couple of months.
What was the school?
On Robson Street, I forget the name of the school.
And you told me once when you were here, this is a different Hotel Vancouver or something?
Yeah, that was the older Hotel Vancouver. It was, funnily enough, when we came back to Canada in 1947 with Mummy and Sylvia and Jenny, they tore down the hotel, the old Hotel Vancouver.
Oh, so it was in 1947 that you built?
The other building had been already built when we came back. But the thing that interested me was that they had a walk-in deep freeze that they wanted $200 for Canadian. And I was sorely tempted to buy it, but the only problem was I didn't know how to move it because the trucks were not designed for that sort of. But I went to the sale.
How long were you in Vancouver?
The time with my mother was 2 months, and the 3 boys. My grandfather also went to Tasmania with us, my mother's father. But he came back to India, he couldn't stand it. So
what was wrong with Tasmania?
Well, the people, they were anti-British at that time, and they were unfriendly, I understand. They had...
Was this just after all the convicts had been sent over there? Or?
No, the convicts went there 200 years ago. But...
so it's their descendants?
Right. But the main thing is they had anti-British, for instance, they said help wanted, no Britisher need apply. In Australia, in Tasmanian restaurants. And it was interesting. I was 8 years old and we used to go to a day school. I live with my parents and go to a day school, and they used to rent out seats on a saddle, so that there'd be 3 or 4 kids riding the same horse and the man leading it to school, and he'd come for you again in the evening and take you home.
The original school bus.
And the other thing I noticed was my father used to get, in the spring, we were only there the one spring, but in the spring my father used to get the plowman to come in with his horses and plow the field between the trees. And the first thing he did when he got there was to put on a billy gong, cooking utensil, and he'd put in about half a pound of tea in this great big bucket, and all day the fire would be under it, ordinary wood fire. It would boil all the time, and every time he came around, he'd have a cup of tea. So it got stronger and stronger and stronger. It's an interesting country, but I mean, I would never compare it even with Canada, because I think in Canada we live a lot better than they do in Australia. We've got all the gadgets.
Yeah. So, at the end of the war, we haven't talked about that at all, what you were doing during the war.
Well, I was training, first and foremost, I was in the civil government.
Conscripted.
I was conscripted in 1941. So
where'd you go?
I was 6 years, in totally 6 years, in Jabalpur all the time, almost. I mean, I spent about 2 months in Lahore, where I was posted to an ordnance depot, and I was just a second lieutenant. Then I went to Jabalpur and I met a fellow called Ponce, who was the colonel in charge of the school at that time. And I reported to him for training, and I stood first in the class. So, there were 40-odd officers, and I was the only untrained officer he had, and I came first. So he thought perhaps it was a good idea to hang on to me. And so he posted me as officer in charge of Indian Wing, and because of my languages, so I had about 30, I used to get 2,000, was it 2,000? Yes, 2,000 students at a time, and give them a 3-month course in ordnance.
Was it like 2,000 students in a room, or?
No, they'd have several rooms, and they'd have several instructors. There were, I think, 48 instructors. So, and you had to write up a syllabus for them to what you were going to teach them. Then you had to drill the instructors to know what to do. And then you separated these students when they arrived and put them into their various classes. And I used to supervise that and also teach ammunition to officers, because I had I had a real instinct for ammunition. I learnt it very quickly, and that's why I did so well. And then...
And the reason mostly for you getting into that is the languages?
Yes. Because most of the regiments in India have only one language. But in ordnance and RISC, Royal Stores, what is it? The storage area, the storage supply thing, they were bilingual. They had lots of languages. So I could speak at least 4 or 5 of them, which was a great help in dealing with the students. So, and I think that's the main reason I got the job, is because, so I,
What languages did you speak?
I used to speak Bengali, Hindi, Urdu, Chhattisgarhi, and Bengali, Hindi, Urdu, Chhattisgarhi, and Telugu, not Tamil. Tamil is a very hard language to learn.
Oh, isn't that what the guy in Tamil spoke, Chris? Swami?
No, he spoke Hindi. He spoke Hindi. And
that actually is. And
so my experience in Jabalpur It was a very satisfactory one. I mean, I had no problems at all. And I was rapidly promoted. I mean, I went from second lieutenant to major in 1 year, and then lieutenant colonel the next year. So, that's very rapid promotion.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, I got very friendly with Fons. Fons was the lieutenant colonel, he was a regular soldier, trained in England, and as I say, a regular commission. And he heard that I lived in Pendle Road, Marna, and he became very interested. So he was a bachelor. We went down, we took a couple of bottles of whiskey, and we went down to drink our Sarasali. That was before Mummy joined me.
Obviously.
And so we had a karma dance and all that sort of thing during the Christmas holidays. And he thoroughly enjoyed all of it. And in fact, I heard later that he ended up buying property there. And he settled with a harem. He had about 4 or 5 women living with him. And that never appealed to me as far as those women were concerned. I thought they were bodily very clean and certainly not bad looking. But they just were below my class, I guess. I just couldn't bear the thought of that. But Rita's father had a harem. While he lived with us, he had a harem.
How many?
4 at least, regularly. And then one girl, I remember, my mother happened to be there, and she was raped by him, and I got very sore at it because I thought that was a poor way to deal with the employees. So she...
Well, what brought Mom's family to India?
Well, he took his discharge in India. The granddad's father, took his discharge in India.
Discharge from what?
From the military. He was visiting India at the time on duty, and he was able to get his discharge. So he and his father, yes. So, wait a minute. No, I can't.
Carol, you talk to Dad. Or actually, sit on Dad's lap.
And his mother was, so anyway, he became the oldest son through the death of his mother and father. His father died from a horseback accident, and his mother died of a broken heart. And Granddad became the oldest brother, several brothers, two brothers, 2 of his brothers and 1 sister. And so that's his story. And then he cut short his education, and he was defrauded of all his money because the guardian that he elected was dishonest. So he ended up poor and had to work as a clerk in the military, Civil and Military Gazette in Lahore. And so then he joined the Missionary Society and became a missionary. And the others I'm not going to worry about. I mean, the aunts and uncles and so on.
Yeah.
But then he was a missionary by the time his wife met him, and she was the result of a illegitimate birth between a maidservant and a lord of England. And they treated her very well, gave her a very good education. She was sent out to India to join a company that paid decent wages and pensions and all the rest of it. And she fell in love with Granddad and married him. And they had 2 children, Tom and Anne. Well, she actually was called Annie. And
were they brought up in an English, proper English type of house, or was it more like a?
no, they were brought up. You know, they were out in had an orchard. He managed an orchard. He didn't own an orchard, but he managed it in the Kulu Valley, which is a very good orchard area. Very good, very productive.
What do you want? Well, you play with yours. What's that? Okay, you sit here. So.
And he had a good job and a good property to run, and I mean he was manager of this fruit orchard in the Kulu Valley, and he owned homes in Dharamsala, which is right next to the Kulu Valley. So he must have had a lot of property, but this fellow, your grandfather, was deprived of it all by shyster. Just like my father. My father was very rich, but he lost it all through trying to double it.
So, I remember Mom saying something about she spent only the winters in Lahore.
Yes. And she only spent 2 months in Lahore. The 2 holiday months, December and January. But otherwise, she spent all her time in Simla, in the Himalayas, 7,000 feet above sea level, which is quite modest climate. In fact, it's the first time I'd ever seen snow was in Simla when we went for our honeymoon. First time I'd ever seen snow.
And how was Mom brought up?
She went to boarding school, and she was in Simla.
Carol.
And then when she then applied for a job after she got her senior Cambridge, she applied for a job in Woodstock, which is an American school where the kids were all boarders. They were all an American missionary school. And so she taught piano and violin. She was an associate of the Royal Academy of Music, so she had both teaching qualifications, and she, of course, sang in the choirs and things. But I mean, she was well qualified for the job she was doing, but of course not paid very well. And so we met as a result of her mother having a boarding house.
Yeah, you had tomatoes, you were eating tomatoes and trying to talk at the same time.
That's what happened in her case. And then, of course, we led a very different life. I mean, I was part of the Indian aristocracy. I mean, you know, we had big houses and great comfort, lots of servants, members of the club, which was very convenient. I mean, the only thing is that Mommy tended to overspend. She spent more than I made. And then we'd sign the chits everywhere. You see, there was no discipline, and all the bills would go to the club, to the club in Jabalpur, the Narbada club. And he'd keep debiting my account, and eventually one check he'd pay everybody, and the one check, the Narbada club check, would go to the bank. And when I started to run out of money, he'd phone me and say, "Take it a bit easier, you're drawing all your money out." You will pretty soon have NSF checks. Of course, they never NSF them because they knew that I was a civil servant and I'd pay. So,
Anyway, what, you were saying about, you went to see New Zealand and then you...
no, I didn't see New Zealand.
Oh.
I met the Commissioner for New Zealand in Delhi many times. And then eventually when he told me, he said you'd have to wait at least 2 years for a car. Well, that was an awful long wait for me, from my perspective.
What was the main reason that you wanted to get out of India?
Because I didn't want to work for an Indian. And I knew that they'd get all the top positions. So I didn't like the idea of working for an Indian. I'd always had Indians working for me.
So you had to find some way to get everybody to Canada?
Yeah, well, they paid for it. I didn't have to do anything about that. They offered me a trip. I had, by length of service and age, I had qualified for 4 months free in any country of my choice. So I bought property when I was out here, and then went back to India after the 4 months, or via England. They didn't have a ship going directly from here to England, so I had to go to India. So I had to go to England first, and then catch a troop ship out to India. And by that time, I mean, both the girls were born.
I want to show you something.
And
I'll show you. Here, let me think.
so I'd been out here already in 1946 for a holiday. And then I went back to Jabalpur, and they told me that I had been posted because they didn't have a job of my seniority. So I had to go to Cawnpore for a little while, and then from Cawnpore I went to Nowshera, where I was in command of the Ordnance Ammunition Depot. And
So what was... So when you finally started the move to Canada, did you just leave everything behind, or did you sell stuff?
well, most of the stuff we sold. We didn't bring very much. And very fortunately, the farm we bought was fully furnished, so we didn't have to worry about that. Otherwise, I would have had to pay a lot of money for furniture. And so we came out on a cargo ship. It was...
You couldn't take much out of India at that time, could you?
You couldn't take money. I mean, the money was very hard to get out. They allowed us $5,000. Yes, $5,000. Total. That's the total amount they would allow you, and then you had to wait 2 years for another installment of $5,000. And that was it. You couldn't bring any more. So we went out and spent money. When I came out the first time, I took back patterns of carpets that were saleable in Canada. And I ordered the factory to make them. I thought I was going to be there 2 years, but as it happened, I only stayed 1 year. And they sent it out to Peggy Kleffner's husband, Jim Graham, who took delivery, got his custom broker to take delivery and store them in their shed until I got out. And these carpets and things like that I bought at the last minute just to bring them out so that I'd have extra money. And some of them I didn't sell, but the big ones I sold them all. And I didn't make a profit on it. I mean, that was the stupidity of it. I didn't know I just thought I should add up all the bills and sell them for that much money. But I could have got 3 or 4 times as much money as I sold them for. However, it was...
So on the way over, you came by ship?
Yeah. Cargo
ship. What was the conditions of that like?
Oh, it was a Dutch ship. I've forgotten the name of it. Talise, a Dutch ship. And I thought it was excellent. I met a,
Did it have staterooms or something?
no, they had converted them into bunks. They had put up bunks for, we had a 6-bunk cabin, so we were very comfortable. And they had a matron on the ship, a Dutch lady, who looked after the kids when they needed looking after. But most of the time, when the bar was open, this fellow with his wife, the wife would look after the kids. They only had one child, and Mummy would look after the 2 girls. When the bar was closed, we'd look after the 3 kids, and the women would be free to do what they liked. But the only trouble was we came almost directly to Halifax. We stopped at Algiers
There you go.
once, and that was the only stop. And then we came all the way to Halifax without any stops anywhere.
How long a trip was that?
We left there on the 20th of November, and we arrived in Halifax on the 22nd of December. Almost a month.
And then you transferred to a train?
And then we had to go through customs at Halifax. And they refused my immigration. They said, no, with your disability you can't farm in Canada. So I said, well, I'm going to farm. I mean, so there's no good my telling you that I'm not going to farm. So they held us up for about 5 or 6 hours while they argued this out, and then they had a full board meet to decide whether I was allowed to come to Canada or not. I said, what are you going to do with me if we don't come to Canada? I mean, you know, you've got us. So eventually they agreed to let me in. And Mummy had dressed the 2 girls all in woolies and so on, thinking it'd be a cold country. We had central heating and we nearly blew our tops. And fortunately on the way over, I had been interpreter for the Indians coming to the embassy in Ottawa. And so they helped us to catch the train. They grabbed the kids and the luggage and ran with us to the train and got us on. Otherwise we'd have missed our train to New Westminster.
And you came all the way across Canada?
All the way by train. And we had warrants to eat and all that. We didn't have to worry about buying food or anything.
The train came with, the train fare came with meals.
With vouchers. You had, you know, they knew how many of us there were. 2 of us and 2 kids. So they gave us vouchers to buy the train meal. And it was very interesting. I'd done the trip 3 times. I mean, across Canada 3 times. Once coming on a holiday, going back, and then coming with the family. The only time we changed was that the one time we came via Jasper instead of via Calgary. So it was a different trip. The time Mummy and I came, we came through Jasper.
Put your plate back down in front of you. 2 hands.
Then, of course, we were here. We farmed for 5 years.
There's your melon.
And we got our second lot of money in 2 years later, 1949, we got our second installment. And then we could buy a truck and a fridge and all the different comforts of life. But the first 2 years, Mummy had to take the clothes. I'd push it for her, but we'd take the wheelbarrow and deliver the clothes to Kathleen Johnson. And Mummy would visit with her, and she would do the washing in her washing machine. Because we didn't have a washing machine. We had a board.
What did Mummy think of all this?
She hated it. Literally hated it. And I mean, it was very nice of her that she'd let me have my day in the park. because I worked extremely hard. I mean, she didn't know how to cook. She didn't know the first thing about keeping children clean. She'd never bathed a child in her life, as far as I know.
She wasn't used to it working.
No work at all. And she always moaned about the fact that, I was too busy. I used to go to work at 7 o'clock in the morning and work till 8, and then I'd milk the cow and the goats in the morning, go back for breakfast, then go out and work. It took me about half an hour to eat a breakfast. And then I'd go out and work until noon, come in and eat lunch, and then lie on the carpet in the living room and sleep for 10 minutes. And then go out again immediately and work till probably 10 o'clock at night, or 8 o'clock at night, and have supper, and then go out and work again till probably 10 o'clock at night. Because then I had the milking to do and all the rest of it. So it was a very busy life, but it put me back in the world of the living. I mean, I was very flabby when I came out. I was very out of condition. But it didn't take very long, and I was in top condition.
So, how long were you at that in Langley?
Well, we lived there for January 48 to July 1954. But I only farmed for 5 years.
Then you went to...
Then I went and joined Mannix. I went first selling pots and pans, aluminum, ready...
you commute to Vancouver every day?
Yes, I used to commute. And I took a job first. I got hired by Mannix, and I went up to the Sticks, to Nechako, near Vanderbilt.
When did Mumford join Canada?
First and foremost, we met the Horns, who are now almost our next door neighbors. And she played piano duets with Charlotte Horn. And Horn was an educated man. I mean, he could talk about things besides mastitis and swine fever. So, it was a little more interesting for me also. I enjoyed his company. And, but then when the girls started growing up in 1953, 54, and the kids were doing very well at school, she said, it's time we moved to town. I mean, that their social sciences are being totally neglected. They're not getting any exposure to arts or music. So we were waiting for our opportunity, and eventually it came. I mean, in 1952, I got Newcastle's disease in the chickens. And that's the time when the chickens are they're the largest number, because you're raising your day-olds to become pullets, and you had capons on the side, and and pigs are prolific and so on. So I got this chicken disease, Newcastle disease, and at that time the government of Canada decided that they wanted to stop it at the border. It hadn't come up to Canada before. So they came and condemned all my chickens to be gassed. So they paid me handsomely for it. I mean, they paid me probably more than I paid for the farm. But anyway, that made it possible for me to sell the pigs. The pigs, I had been to the auction the week before and taken some pigs down, and standing next on the rail, leaning on the rail, this fellow next to me said, "Whose pigs are those?" I said, "Mine. I've entered them." So he said, "Well, if you ever want to sell pigs," he said, "give me a shout." So I took his phone number, and I phoned him very shortly afterwards and said, "If you want the pigs, they're yours if you agree to my price." And he agreed to my price immediately. I never had to question him. And so the goats went back to the lady who had sold them to us, because she wanted them to exhibit them in the PNE. So all I was left with was the one cow, and I sold that to a friend of ours who was glad to have her. I mean, she was a nice cow. And then I commuted for 2 years to Vancouver. I went up to Nechako in 1952, in August of 1952, hired by Mannix. And then we got up there, and I was a temporary staff. I mean, I wasn't hired on a permanent basis. And they took me as a timekeeper, and then eventually took me into the office as a clerk. And then they had a crisis, and they asked all the staff to be at the staff room. And so he asked for volunteers to do some reconciliation job. I don't know what I forget what it was. So I waited until they'd had a long time, and so Busby said, well, either you're going to volunteer or I'm going to conscript somebody. So I then put up my hand and I said, I'll volunteer. So he took me into his office. You know, I wouldn't have even met him for years if it hadn't been for this crisis. And he said, this is the system we keep our account on. And we are having very large claims from the suppliers. We don't believe they're that large. We have got reason to believe that we should be able to convince them that we owe them less. So he said, charge as many hours overtime as you like, do whatever you like, so long as you reconcile them. So I said, that's fine. And I took over all the accounts that were in dispute, and one by one I managed to reconcile them. And every time I reconciled a big account, I got a free trip to Vancouver. They'd fly me to Prince George, give me a return ticket for Vancouver, and the fellow from the purchasing department would meet me at the airport and give me a car, rent a car, and I'd drive out to Langley. I always came on a Friday, so that I'd have 2 days at home. And then on the Monday, I'd come and reconcile the account, Pennings or Dietrich Collins or whoever it happened to be. And then I'd go back on Monday evening for work on Tuesday. And so it worked very well. And so I went to my office manager in Busby, and I said, how many hours should I charge? I told him honestly the circumstances. He said, charge whatever you've been averaging all the time. He said, this job is worth doing. So I accepted it, and I was naive, I suppose. But anyway, that's how I came to Mannix's attention. And then when I came back to Vancouver after the job was finished, they kept me on to reconcile payrolls and things in the Vancouver office. So it was, and then from that, who is a brother and Fred Mannix, he opened in Mapo, culvert making and importing and exporting machinery. So I got a job with that. And then, what happened next? Oh, Alan, the first time I met Fred Mannix, he came into the office and he said, who's in charge here? And the girl said, as far as we know, Titus Oates is in charge. So he said, bring him down here, I want him in the manager's office. So I came down, and all the faults that he had found with Alan, who was the manager, he blasted me about them. And he swore like a fiend, you know. In those days, he used to swear like a Trojan. And so after it was all over, he said, have you anything to say? I said, yes, I sure have. I have never in my life met a fouler-mouthed man than you are. And I said, I don't really think I want to work for you. So he said, come and have lunch at the club. And that started a very long and friendly association. I worked for them for 22 years. So, you know, and then I had that experience, and then Alan had the money from his father, and he bought the company from Mannix. And Mannix was glad to sell it. And then they gave me a job up in Styx in Vancouver Island, Port McNeill. For 10 years I was there. That was in 1957, and then I worked in the Vancouver office. I was only up in Port McNeill on visits. I never stayed up there. And we used to sell the ore to the Japanese. And then we lost $6.8 million. That was the awful experience we had. And then I was posted to Calgary. And then we lived in Calgary for a year. Then I was transferred to Leslie. And I stayed there for 5 or 6 years. And it was most of it was very, very enjoyable. So that's the story of my life.
Encapsulated form.
Encapsulated.